Hi everyone, welcome to the first Torah study of the fall 2023 semester. Today is the day after Labor Day, so I wanted to talk about something related to labor. So I want to talk about strikes, and what is the source in Jewish law for striking. But just a little background a second. Does anyone know why Labor Day is now in the fall? Or what does Labor Day stand for? That's a better question. What does Labor Day stand for? So the first Labor Days were in the 1880s. And in the 1880s, there was, with the industrialization of the world and factories, especially in New York, which was where the first Labor Day began, there was a push to recognize. There was a push to recognize the achievements and to appreciate workers. But there was another reason. Does anybody here know what May Day is? May 1st, May Day? Yeah, what is that?
It was the anniversary of the Haymarket affair.
Well, correct. So May Day is actually known as International Workers' Day. And there was actually a competing interest. There was a very strong communistic and socialistic
I was about to say.
Yeah.
Union, they would May 1st was the Labor Day.
Right. So Labor Day in that sense was more like a rights of workers and anti-capitalist day. So part of establishing Labor Day was in September was so that it shouldn't be May Day. It was like we appreciate workers. Workers are great in the capitalist system as opposed to destroying the capitalist system. So, as you all are aware, and again, this is not a history class, you're aware that strikes and striking and fighting for rights of workers was a constant struggle in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Famously, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. As this is a Torah class, some of you, it's an interesting phenomena that most of the workers who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were Jewish, but also the owners were. And what was interesting is the owners represented the first wave of immigration, the German Jewish immigration in the mid-1800s, and they were successful immigrants who became factory owners. The owners of the factory were themselves immigrants who worked themselves up from peddlers to factory owners. And then they were employing the next round of immigrants which is the Eastern European, the Russian immigrants of the 1910s. So it's an interesting phenomenon that both sides of the owners, the capitalists, if you like, and the workers were both Jewish, and so it's a part of the story of labor and labor unions and striking was definitely had a very Jewish component. For those of you noticed on my sign, that's why I like saying this. Every time I make the sign, I put in a picture, which is I guess the trivia or represents. So it's on when you walk out the cafeteria, you'll see it on the board. But the sign is actually from the funeral. And from the strike that resulted from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and there it says, international Hebrew workers, and part of the strikes were the Jewish workers of the time. But as we're all well aware, if you striking is a new thing. There were no labor strikes pre-industrial revolution. Doesn't make sense. So it's very hard, when you're getting a Torah class and when you're looking at the sources, how would you find a source about striking in sources that predate the concept? Well, there's one source, and that's page 1. It's a little bit of a long source. Before we get into general workers' rights and concepts, the first source is from the Talmud. The Talmud is discussing a very interesting point. And again, there are handouts there. Please feel free to take handouts. The Talmud is talking about there was a certain group of skilled workers in the temple. One group of skilled workers knew how to make a certain type of showbread. In Hebrew, lechem hapanim, the showbread, the special bread that was eaten by the priests, the kohanim, in the temple. The other craftsmen or workers, they knew how to make the incense. They knew how to compound the spices for the incense perfectly. The showbread had to be a certain type of bread with a certain type of form, and the spices had to be, the incense had to rise up to heaven in a perfectly straight column. Okay, so and these the Talmud tells us there were two families. One was the house of Garmu and the house of Avtinus. So what's interesting, and that's the point here, was Jeff. Do you want to? Should we close the door? Yeah, thank you. So it says they were so if you look here on page 1, it says the craftsmen of the house of Garmu didn't want to teach the others the secret of their production. That means they wanted to keep the skill in their family. The sages fired them and said, you know what? Okay, we're going to get other people to make our, again, the story happened repeated twice, to make our bread or to make our incense. And they brought in from Alexandria. Alexandria back at the time was one of the, the leading technologically advanced societies. The library in Alexandria. Yes?
No, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Why didn't they want to share it, and why was it a problem that the rabbis wanted them to share it?
So they didn't want to share it because they were, again, the question was, why didn't they want to share it? So the Talmud said they didn't want to share it. So there was both a good reason and, of course, a personal reason. They didn't want to share it, maybe because they wanted it to be their families who always worked. They wanted to keep the knowledge amongst the family. But they also didn't want this holy knowledge, which was set aside for temple use, to fall into secular hands. Or maybe it'll end up in a pagan temple.
Rabbi, did the rabbis even have the power to demand these Kohen priests to disclose such information?
Oh, so exactly. So exactly the Talmud, that's the question. So the Talmud says, the sages fired them, and they brought in craftsmen from Alexandria, but it didn't work. It just didn't work. So now the sages were stuck. They needed the right craftsmen who made these breads and this incense, but they couldn't find it. So they went back to them, and they said to them, here in paragraph 3, when the sages heard the matter, they went and they said, whatever the Holy One, blessed be, he created in his honor. As it says in Isaiah, everyone is called by my name, I created for my glory. And in other words, they're saying, listen guys, we need you. God needs you. And they said, you know what? We're not coming back. You fired us. We're on strike. We're not coming back. You thought you could get rid of us and just hire any, random workers. You can't. So now we're not coming back. And they doubled their wages, and then they came. And not only that, they kept doubling it. And then there's a debate. So what's it? Yeah, the question?
Sorry to keep it.
No problem. Go ahead.
Wouldn't they be considered second Mamre because they made a decision and they were going up against it?
So the question is, are they a rebellious leader by going against the sages?
Yeah.
The answer is that a rebellious leader is only when you have a disagreement of how to interpret the Torah and one way versus the other. When the Sanhedrin, when the court interprets or passes a law, an interpretation of the law, and you disagree, then you are a rebellious elder. If you don't comport to the institute of the rabbis, then you might be not a great person, but you're not disagreeing how to interpret the Torah. You're not disagreeing with anything, so you're not a rebellious person.
Are you saying that there's no interpretation factor here?
No, it's not interpretation. It's a question of who's going to do the work. There's no interpretation question.
But maybe they're interpreting who should be doing the work.
No, that's not. No, it's not based on a verse. It's because they had a skill. They had it. That was it.
But it's oral Torah that was passed down, right?
But it's not oral Torah. It's just a skill they got somehow. It's not a part of the Torah. Assumingly.
Wouldn't you have to say that?
You ask a question. Why didn't the sages figure it out from the Torah itself? That's a question. I'll have to leave for another time. But that question, yeah. Somehow they had the skill not Torah based. Because if they did, then the sages would know it. Okay. And then at the end of there's a famous Gemara, or a famous type of Gemara, where Rabbi Kiva says, one time he and Rabbi Shmuel ben Loga said they were walking and they met one of these people and they're crying. They're crying that how it used to be the temple, and they said we are bound by an oath not to show it to any person. So if this is in a way the only source for striking in the Torah, where they said we're not coming to work until they got their demands. But the difference would be here they were fired already. Here they weren't working at the time. Rather, they were fired, and now someone wants to hire them. They said, even though they had a godly calling to do what God wants, they said, we're not coming unless you treat us with more respect or with higher wages. The question that we have to deal with is, when people, what is the basis? Is there a basis? Are you allowed to strike when you're already employed? Are you allowed to form a union pre-employment that we all get together, like collective bargaining, and say we're not going to work unless you pay us all the minimum wage and give us a 35-hour, 40-hour work week? So we have to understand, we have to remember that in the 1800s and the early 1900s, there were no labor laws. There was no child labor laws. There was no minimum wage, and there was no maximum hours per week or work week. One of the only people, unfortunately, because we don't like mentioning this person, the first person to come up with a work day and 5-day a week work instead of 6-day was Henry Ford, who we don't like mentioning because he was a rabid anti-Semite who used his popularity and his newspaper to publish, literally the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But he understood, he did it because he said, listen, it's the best thing for workers if they have 2 days off and if they work less. But he didn't come to it, he actually they made a documentary. He was actually sued by a man named Aaron Spira, who was there was no Jews couldn't sue. There was nothing against. There was no law saying if you say all the Jews are bad, which is what he did. But he libeled a man named Aaron Spira, saying that he was unionizing people and that he was a communist and he's bad and he's the worst. And it was a trial. And Henry Ford was defended by a U.S. senator. So his anti-Semitism was, the lawyer for Henry Ford was a senator. So to show you how pervasive the anti-Semitism was, I know it's a little bit off track, the trial was not going in Henry Ford's favor, and therefore he settled, and he wrote an apology. It's a very famous letter. He goes, I didn't really mean what I said, but whatever. And that's a history lesson. We're going to go on from that. So if you take a look here, page 2, the first, I guess, and part of the answer would be to a lot of our questions is, where are labor laws in the Torah? Where are labor laws in the Talmud? And the answer is, there aren't that many. Because the Talmud tells us, and I'm going to read the last line first of the first source, everything should follow local custom. In Hebrew, hakol keminhag hamedina. Everything follows a local custom. So if you want to ask me what the local labor laws are, very simple. Go look at your local labor laws. If everyone has minimum wage, well, that's the labor law. So part of the answer to the question is, well, if everyone's doing it, that becomes actually the Torah law. Okay, so now, but if you're in 1885, 1887, and there is no minimum wage, and can you get up and say, I will not work unless the minimum wage? Like, who are you? There's no such law. So, the next source, and in this source is debated. Some rabbis say this is the best source, and some rabbis say this source makes no sense. What is the source? So again, you have a contracted worker, a poel in Hebrew, a contracted worker. So I have a field. My field needs to be picked. It's apple picking season, right? I own an orchard. I hire you to pick. I hire you to work in my field. I'll give you $5 an hour to work in my field, pick all the apples. It comes noon. It's a hot day today. You didn't realize it was going to be 90 degrees. And at lunch, you say to me, I'm sorry, I'm not working the rest of the day. And I say to you, we agreed. We had an agreement, contract if you'd like. You have to work sunrise to sundown or 9 to 5, whatever it may be. We made a deal. You cannot back out. So the Gemara says, the Talmud says, Poel, a worker, may reconsider and leave his job even at midday. Now in theory, he's not allowed. Why? We have a contract. You agree, we have a handshake, we have whatever is binding a contract. Why can you back out? So the Talmud says something very interesting. It's based on a verse in Leviticus where God says, the Jewish people are my servants. And the rabbis interpret that to mean they are God's servants and not man's servants. Therefore, even though we have a contract, You could always invoke the God clause and say, you don't have to work for me because you work for God. And if you're not happy, you have the right to always back out of the contract and say, I'm not working. So, I hired you, I need my apples picked, and I say, 12 o'clock, you say it's too hot outside, I can't force you. That's it. I can't go to court, say you breach a contract, can't do any of that. So in theory, you say this is a great source. Except, in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, he brings this law, but then he said, I have the English here, it's not the greatest translation, but it's decent. He says, when does the above apply? Meaning, when can the worker back out of his agreed contract to work for the day? With regard to work that does not involve an immediate loss. So, the truth is, if the apples stay on the tree an extra day, it's not the end of the world. Apples, apple picking, it's okay, an extra day. So if you don't pick the rest of the day, I'll find another worker tomorrow. But let's say it's something that if I didn't pick it today, it would spoil. Then you cannot back out. If, however, the work involves an immediate loss, and again, the examples are you hired workers to move flax from the vat, donkey to bring flutes for a funeral or a wedding, and then the wedding's today. So if I hired you to go and bring, the band for the wedding tonight, and you say, you know what, I don't feel like driving today, you can't back out. We had an agreement, you have to do it. What happened to that? You are God's servant and not man's. No, that only applies when you're not messing me over. But if you agree to do something which is time sensitive, you cannot back out. Yes?
Would loss of a sale
so very good. So right. So that's again. That would go to the nitty gritty. There's loss. Current meaning, if you have flax in your vat which will spoil, that's a loss. That means that you cause loss. Causing someone not to gain is not always a loss. Which is your question. Your question is, in other words, if tomorrow is the apple farmer's market. So if I don't pick my apples today, I won't make any money in the apple farmer's market tomorrow. So does that?
Have those apples afterwards.
I'll have the apples afterwards, but tomorrow's the day of sale. And if I don't have the apples today, I'm messed over. So that's a good question. The rabbis debate whether or not does it have to be an actual loss, something's going to be lost, or future gain, which is understanding that's why the work is that included? And that's debatable again. But either way, the point is, again, that's the rabbi debate. Either way, the point is, the fact that a worker could back out is not 100%. See, so that is why this is a debate, if this is a good source or not. On one hand, we see workers, even already contracted workers, have some rights, say I'm not working, and if it's not good for me. On the other hand, it's very limited because it has to. So now, imagine you are a shirtwaist factory owner. For those of you who don't know, shirtwaist, it was a fancy 1900 word for a blouse because it had a waist and it was different than a man's shirt. It was a woman's shirt, and the way it worked in the sweatshops of the Lower East Side was that each they made different parts and you brought it in. It's sort of irrelevant, sort of, but so you hired 1,000 young people, immigrants, to work in your factory. And all of a sudden, one day they'd say, we're not working because we want you to pay us minimum wage. We have a contract. You signed the contract that you're working 6 days a week for half of minimum wage. You can't back out now. You can't. We have a deal. We have a contract. So on one hand, you can say, we have the right not to work. I said, yeah, but maybe, let's say in your example, if the garment industry's busy season is October 1st, so everyone's buying their fall clothing, then you have no right to back out. So it's a big debate if this source is a good source. Just for the fun of it, if you take a look, I have a few, if you look at page 5 and 6. So, what I have for you is just from response to literature. If you take a look at top of page 6, this rabbi was rabbi. So this question was from the 1940s in Israel, and many of you know that again pre-state. This is Palestine. This is not Israel, but there was a very strong labor union, still very strong today, called the Histadrut, still today, and they wanted to know about striking in general. So the rabbi at the time they asked was this rabbi, his name is Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, Tzitz Eliezer, and he was one of the first rabbis. There's again, the rabbis were really only asked these questions starting in the 1910, 1920. So if you take a look at the top of page 5, that's Rabbi Hershenson. He was the rabbi of Hoboken, New Jersey, and he was one of the leading rabbis in America. So that's his, and he says, you know what? If you see, I don't know if you, for those of you who read Hebrew letters, he has strikes in Hebrew, on top of page 5, on the first line, right? Shvitat hapoalim, strikes. And he translates, could anyone make up the third to last line? It's in parentheses. Samach kuf ayin beis saf, samach. Those are scabs. Right? Remember, that's the word for those who break the picket line. So this is one of the earliest questions. This is Rabbi Hershenson. This is Tzitz Eliezer from 1941 in Israel. And they both say, you know what? I don't have any good sources. And Rabbi Waldenberg went out of his way to say, don't bring me this source in Talmud Bava Metzia at page 10a. Don't bring it to me because it has no relevance. Because he feels that once you sign a contract and the work is necessary for the owner, that it's not relevant. Now, if you'll take a look here on the bottom left of page 5, you have someone named Chaim Zev Reinis. For those of you who read Hebrew, it's New York. Iyar, which is the spring, Tuf Reish Tzadeh, that's 1935. And he, yeah?
Sorry, when you say contract, does the contract has to be based on the laws of the land?
Yeah, so that's what we started with at page 2, that all labor laws follow the normal labor laws. And there were no labor laws, and that's sort of the point. So it doesn't mean the law of the land, it was normal to employ 7-year-olds. So then it's normal. Then the Torah would say, okay, great. Once that became illegal, then you can't say, well, the Torah allows me to hire 7-year-olds. No, you can't hire 7-year-olds anymore. But in 1882, there was nothing stopping you from employing 7-year-olds in your factory, both because of the local law and therefore the Torah law. So here you have just a sampling of the different rabbis of 1910, 1920, 1930, and the latest one we have here is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, bottom of page 5 and page 6, from 1951 and 1954. Now, what I'm not going to talk about today, which I spoke about, this year I'm giving today in honor of Labor Day, but also because I just gave a shiur in the medical school about can doctors and teachers strike. Essential workers might have a different set of laws. Okay, and this was very relevant to teachers in 1954. Again, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, striking was very normal. And in Israel, doctors, till this day, but especially in the 1970s and 80s, were paid nothing. And in 1983, all the doctors in Israel went on strike. And there was a big debate whether they can, because maybe essential worker has no choice. This is the same question we could deal with for those of you in health science. Please God, there won't be another pandemic. But if there's another pandemic, can you force frontline workers to work? This is a question.
Especially if it's harmful to them.
Right, do they have to put themselves on the line? Correct. Do they have the right not to work? When I was in college a few years ago, there was still something called AIDS, not just HIV, there was an AIDS epidemic, and there was a big debate. Can you force someone to treat an AIDS patient? So that's a secondary question of, do essential workers, here, doctors and teachers, can you force them, do they even have, even if you would agree that a general worker has the right to strike, what about essential workers? But we're not going to talk about that, but the source for that is actually from 1954, from by Feinstein over here. Okay, but if you take a look now on page 3, going back to page 3, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and almost all others say, you know where the right to strike comes from? We would call it back, I guess, in more historical terms, a guild. Today, we maybe call it a union. But what happened was, it was very normal that all the butchers, you might call this maybe a monopoly, you might call this illegal in some places, but back then a guild had rights to make rules for all members of that trade or guild. So here it says, it is permitted for residents of the city to set measures used in the city, meaning to define weights and measures, which the price is set, and the wages paid to its workers. And now that to fine people for violating the specifications. So all the butchers of the town could say, we are, undercutting is a great way to drum up business, but it also is not fair. And the same thing is vice versa. A monopoly is not fair because then there's driving up and down prices. That's how economics works. We're not going to learn about economics now. So but according to the Talmud, workers can get together and say, we're all the butchers in town, and we all agree that we're not working for less than X. Or we all agree that we're going to charge a price of a pound of ground meat is not less or not more than XYZ. And they can then punish, that becomes the law. And they could punish those members who disagree or who violate it. So we see here, that means the concept of a union, or the concept of people gathering together and making decisions for this group, which is binding on all members of the group, whether they agree or not. And that means it's sort of like a democracy, that if the majority of butchers decide X, the minority of butchers have to follow. So if all garment workers got together and said, we refuse to work for less than minimum wage, it would be binding on all garment workers. And then scabs would not be allowed according to the Torah. This is brought out more in a Tosefta. A Tosefta is a Talmudic time period, teaching not found in the Talmud. That's why I didn't have the English here. But it says here on page 3 that the people of the town could force each other to build communal resources like a synagogue, to buy a Torah scroll. Not only that, they could all get together and agree on prices and on weights and measurements, and here it says explicitly wages of workers. So if the town people could say, in our town, everyone makes a living wage. That is then binding on every member of the town. So that means if McDonald's would come along and says, we don't, listen, we're paying less than minimum wage, and we know people will work here no matter what, they would be in violation. So the source of the, not of striking, but of collective bargaining, or the workers going at it saying, we cannot work, will not work for less than minimum wage, that has a source. But again, it doesn't really teach us about striking, where you could go walk off the job. It teaches that preemptively, you could all get together, we could all get together and say, we are the garment workers, none of us are going to work from now on less than minimum wage. That would be allowed. But if you have a pre-existing contract, you wouldn't be able to nullify the contract. So that's where striking is a little bit more difficult. Now, we do find, and I know I'm going to try to be a little brief here, we do find in the Talmud some labor laws that seem to be very, I guess, labor friendly. Here we are on Labor Day, after Labor Day. If you hire, so imagine again, this happened, again, we're not going to the history of labor, but let's say you hire a worker. It's better. Let's say you hire a worker, 9 to 5, and you pay him, and then at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, he's a great worker. And he collected all the apples. All the apples are now off the trees. Right? So you say, okay, have a good day, I'll pay you 3 hours. He says, no, we agreed the whole day, I just work quickly. So the Talmud says, you have to pay him. I mean, you have to pay him, and either find him a task equal or easier, but you have to give him the full wages. And the Talmud says, what do you mean? I'll pay him like, listen, okay, I won't pay you. We're not working the rest of the day, 12 to 5. So I'll pay you, nothing, a few dollars sit around, which is cheaper than to pay actual workers. So the Talmud talks about it because work is, I want to work. Work is good for me. So here it says, the only time a laborer has a right to back out is when he hears of a relative who died, or if he's sick. So the Talmud already has sick days, and already Talmud has that you're not penalized if you miss work because you're sick, which again which is a very progressive, that didn't exist in 1882. If you were sick, you didn't come to work, you just didn't get paid. Here, if you have a contract, you're a worker, and you're sick, you still get paid. So in some ways, the Talmud was very ahead of its time in giving workers rights also. But on the other hand, obviously the concept of just reneging a contract was not part of the Talmud. Okay, well, let's just go a little quick here. If you have to take a look here, at the bottom of page 4, and again, back to the custom. What does it mean, the bottom of the custom? It says, it was customary that the workers provided food. Now, it wasn't Google, it wasn't Apple. They had all these, Starbucks on tap. I don't know what they have at these wonderful companies, but you had to provide them food. And if the factory owner, the employer, tries to say, listen, I'll get you food, just work hard and all that, it all follows the custom. So the Talmud was aware that there were some times that the employer would try to abuse and eke out or exact out of the worker more work, and the answer is you got to follow the local custom. So the question is, if we don't have a source for striking, we have a source for collective bargaining, that's clear. And the Talmud definitely has pro-worker sentiment, even to the point of sick days, and minimum wage, which is what we saw before, that they can collectively bargain, but we don't find the right of striking. And it's very interesting. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and again, we don't. So I have the. If you, I found this in English. On the last page, I found someone who translated the whole responsa of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein into English. So this is from 1954, the one I was talking to you about this teacher strike in Detroit. And here Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was very pro labor, and again, with teachers, there's a little of a stringency that he dealt with. On the matter of principle, whether workers have the right to strike for salary increase or to prevent others from working, no strike, your honor request in my opinion. Rabbi Usher wrote in the passage, which is BB means Baba Basa, which we saw, that a tradesman in a given trade can make binding stipulation, and they are considered as a totality of townspeople. Therefore, the unions in our country have a source in Jewish law, for they are the tradespeople of a given trade, and they constitute the majority. So, right, and but most right as for fine. Then he speaks about here in the second paragraph. Some rabbis in the Middle Ages said, even though the tradespeople of a town have a right to enforce laws, they have to run it by the rabbi or by the elected officials. And that would be a big debate, how to apply that in modern times. So again, he disagrees. If you take a look here, it says, therefore, they have the right to decide not to work until they receive higher pay. And they have the right to oppose the decision on the minority. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is very pro-labor and gives them the right to strike. We could argue and say, well, it doesn't say that in the sources. It only says they can collectively bargain, not to basically back out of a contract. And if you take a look here on the page 6, I couldn't translate it to Hebrew, I don't have the time really, I'm sorry. This is from the Chazon Ish, where he writes that he doesn't see the right to strike so much, but really they could force collective bargaining. And a lot of the rabbis of Israel, and here Rabbi Reines and Rabbi Waldenberg, they were not pro-strike, they were pro-forcing collective bargaining, which again is a sort of in-between. On one hand, that means the state or the authorities have the right to force both the employees to work and the employers to hire people and not renege the contract. But if there's a complaint about wages, it would be the state or the elected officials who got to decide, neither the employees nor the employers. And again, it's a big discussion who gets to decide in the communal manners. So I do thank you for this quick overview, for joining me for this Torah study, the overview of labor laws in the Torah. Hopefully this will be the beginning of many Torah studies this semester. Thank you. Have a great day.